everybody, in this video we are dealing with the issue of foreign missions, specifically women's involvement in foreign missions. Okay, so in this unit in general, we have been focused on the 19th and early 20th centuries. This was a time when Western powers were establishing imperialistic policies over other foreign nations, primarily in the global south. Imperialism and colonialism are not the same thing, though of course they are related. Imperialism is a policy of extending one's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. And of course, there's also economic imperialism. We really see this with the United States. That's a really good example of economic imperialism. Okay. Whereas colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and then exploiting it economically. Okay, obviously these terms are related, but I want you to know the difference so you know why I'm using a certain term when I do. Okay, so it would be a mistake to assume that all missionaries were always acting on the behalf of their governments, okay, because often they were not actually. But undeniably, these mission fields became open because of these imperialistic policies, and often missionaries did carry with them beliefs, either consciously or subconsciously, of culture, of kind of superior culture and religious superiority, okay. There is this sort of uncomfortable fact that women in the West were able to gain power and authority in their own context through mission activity, and they were simultaneously acting as agents of cultural imperialism through some of this, okay? This is not to say that Western women weren't sincere in their desire to convert or to help other women around the world. Many of them were incredibly sincere and incredibly invested in this, okay? It's a complicated situation, all right? The truth is Western women were able to do things in mission fields that they would never be able to do at home, all right? Women were missionaries, they were preachers, doctors, a lot of doctors, okay? Women's missionary boards were able to control an incredible amount of money, as I will demonstrate in a little bit, okay? So when I look at the stages of women's involvement in global missions, there are some pretty distinct stages that I'll discuss. Then I'll move into the 19th century Protestant missions, and then we'll look at the importance of like women's missions boards and then women missionaries. Okay. Now first, this is probably obvious, but worth noting, missions did not start in the 19th century, but this is the time when Protestant global missions really explodes. Okay, I'm not going to talk about Catholic missions here, but it is worth noting that while Protestant women are becoming more active in Protestant missions, Catholic women, most notably Catholic sisters, were also getting involved in global missions to a greater degree. Just so you know, okay, but I'm going to leave it there. Now, the founding of missionary societies, largely in the 19th century, pushed Protestant missions to explode in popularity, okay? It was the work of, if you remember this guy from history too, this British missionary, William Carey, through the, and I will quote this correctly, the Particular Baptist Society for Propagating the Gospel Amongst the Heathens. It was changed to later the Baptist Missionary Society for obvious reasons. But this was founded in 1792, and this really started, this popular wave of missionary societies that dominated foreign missions through the 19th and early 20th century. Soon there were missionary societies being formed all over Europe, all over the United States, okay? Just a brief note on Carey here. He was groundbreaking in many ways, but it's kind of an interesting and sad fact. His wife never wanted to be a missionary. She did not like it, and she ended up dying young out in the field, okay? And I mention this because the earliest women missionaries were missionary wives, okay? And that's what they were called, missionary wives. And some women felt really called to this, and others didn't, all right? But I want to return to the importance of these missionary societies. Okay. Very quickly, women decided to form their own missionary societies, either independently or within a denomination, which often excluded men from their membership. Already in the year 1800, you have a woman named Mary Webb who founds the Boston Female Society for Missionary Purpose, which was a group that included Congregationalist and Baptist women, so they could send their own missionaries, all right? Which brings up the question, like, why were women forming their own societies when their denominations were already sending missionaries through kind of like a general missionary board? Well, simply put, this was a question of power and influence, okay? Women were largely being excluded from missionary boards, and while their fundraising skills were always very, very welcome, they were not the ones to make decisions on where the funds went. Women consistently believed that male-run boards were not providing adequate financing for women missionaries, nor were they attentive enough to the needs of foreign women in the missionary fields, okay? Up on the screen here, I have an example of a Lutheran women's missionary society, one that was really, really active. It's called the Women's Missionary Society of the Augustana Synod, and they were officially organized in 1892 with 50 members. Most were wives of pastors, and they kind of came together during one of the Synod annual meetings to found this, okay? Emmy Ewald of Chicago was their first president, and then there was a number of vice presidents selected, one from each conference in the Augustana Synod. Okay, so these women are coming together. They're going to create their own this missionary society, so they can send their own missionaries, even though the Augustana Synod was already sending missionaries. Okay. All right, so up on the screen, I have a list of some of the spending for this particular women's missionary society. But their primary concerns were spreading the gospel and building a hospital in India for women and children. In 1900, they sent their first missionary to Puerto Rico. 2 years later, they sent a nurse to India. What they really, really wanted to do was send a woman doctor to India. But it's 1902, and there weren't many women doctors in the United States or really anywhere. And they couldn't find anyone to send. So they found a pretty creative solution. They ended up sending a young woman named Betty Nelson to medical school. And then after she graduated from medical school, she was sent to India in 1908. Okay. On the slide, you can see their budget from 1906, and Nelson was still in med school. Okay. But this group is pretty typical of the time. This organization was, under the umbrella of the Augustana Synod, but the women completely controlled what they were doing. In fact, their leader, Emmy Ewald, was known for kicking men out of meetings and referring to them as the enemy. Okay. So it's very clear that the women on these boards wanted to control their own finances. Okay. All right. That is the primary thing that you need to take away from this. The success of these women's boards actually became their downfall. Some of these mission boards controlled so much money, it's actually shocking. This particular one that I have up now, at one point, their budget was bigger than the entire denomination's budget, all right? So in the early 20th century, a number of denominations took over these women's missionary boards, okay? All right, finally, let's talk a little bit about the missionaries themselves. The first Protestant women sent on these missionary journeys were the wives of male missionaries, all right? There's a lot of biography of missionary wives, and nearly all of them include some sort of conversion experience followed by a desire to be useful, okay? In more modern terms, we may understand this longing as kind of their sense of call to ministry, okay? With societal limits to women's engagement in ministry in the West, the emerging field of global missions provided women an opportunity to engage abroad in ways that would have been nearly impossible at home. All right, so from the beginning, missionary boards understood the importance of their presence. Okay, missionary wives were needed to support their husbands, to be so they could concentrate on the work. They took on the traditional roles of wives and mothers, in these foreign mission fields, but they also had this added task which cannot be overlooked. All right, they were not just there to be support and comfort to their husbands, but they were also supposed to provide critical evangelism in the field. All right, fashioned as assistant missionaries, they were expected to minister to other women. Okay. This was just kind of a simple, like a practical reality, all right? Male missionaries generally did not have access to women. Without converting the wives, the mothers, the daughters of men, they understood that the entire operation was doomed to fail, and both missionaries and mission boards understood this. Okay, so you need to think for just a minute, like, what all is expected of these missionary wives for a second, okay? There undoubtedly was a level of idealism that many missionaries held prior to the arrival on the mission fields. The reality of the situation was generally much more difficult than they anticipated. Disease, overwork, and far too often deaths were the fate of these missionary wives, okay? Life was pretty hard for these missionary wives, and one of the most significant issues was that the missionaries were overburdened with caring for the children, the house, and then their position as a missionary to all the other women. Okay, so they're basically doing the full work of a missionary, but with all this other added burdens of child rearing, house care, caring for the husband, all that. Okay, so due to these conflicting needs on missionary women, it became glaringly apparent to missionaries in the field that single women who are not overburdened with caring for a family were needed, okay? So then we start seeing the introduction of single women going out into the mission field. Yes, of course, there was some pushback on this, but missionaries themselves were adamant that this was necessary. Okay, now, whether single or married, missions provided women an opportunity to engage in activities that were largely unavailable in the West. So women founded day schools, boarding schools, they wrote catechisms, they completed Bible translations, and generally worked to promote education and literacy. It was not only in the arena of teaching and evangelism, but medicine. I mentioned Betty Nelson earlier. While women doctors were fairly uncommon in the West, there is becoming a ton of them out in the mission fields. Okay. So we see this kind of complicated picture of, what women are doing on the mission fields versus what they're doing at home, what women are doing through these mission boards, and the kind of power and influence they're exerting through these mission boards as well. All right. So it creates a fairly complicated picture of global missions. All right. I'm going to wrap up right now. This is a topic that we can come back to and talk about in the future as we kind of move past this initial stage of missionary work. All right, everybody. Thanks. Bye.